Yeah, Charlie. Yeah, in case you didn't know, or were somehow a bit unsure about whether or not antinatalism was a nihilist philosophy, antinatalism is perplexingly nihilist, nihilistic supreme. That means it's the grand chalupa with fresh sour cream. The most standard, commonly known definition of nihilism is a philosophical doctrine that suggests the negation of one or more reputedly meaningful aspects of life. If nay you say, then are you implying that antinatalism isn't asking its prospective antinatalist to negate certain values that the majority of humans all share in common? I mean, it's called antinatalism, isn't it? Asking a human to consciously avoid procreating, whether just, correct, most moral, or not, is still a value subtraction equation. The idea that consciousness is better off to never have existed is certainly a negative value conclusion, even if you twist around the narrative to demonize the perceived opposition. If some condition independent of consciousness that exists out there in the universe is somehow a morally better configuration in all its independently existing isolated betterness, without anything existing, any unavoidable prognosis, prescription, or proscription that may be proposed will all be subtraction transactions. That's antinatalism, and that's the common understood consensus as to what the definition of nihilism is. There's no way around it. If you are an antinatalist, then you are nihilist, or at least nihilistic. Period. Yeah, a dirty, stinking, value-negating nihilist. And I understand why antinatalists want to reject nihilism. For, while suggesting the negation of a commonly held, meaningful value, they do so under the banner of a righteous pro-value, which is all well and good, but it still doesn't change the fact that the aim is still to negate a value. And I'm not even against antinatalism. In fact, I agree that for people who are serious about discovering the truth about reality and seek to walk the path of self-recognition, of which is the only existential function for why we are here, procreation isn't helpful. It's an investment, which is a distraction, and that's passing the buck to someone else. And for the people who are not serious about reality, the truth, and self-recognition, you definitely shouldn't be procreating either. Because you are just recklessly creating giant amounts of demand and deprivation just for its own sake. And that isn't a requirement. If one is not seeking to understand the reality, then why should one be ignorantly pushing more lives into existence for the mere sake of selfish gratification? It's an abuse of power. You don't have any way to obtain consent for the life that you are causing to manifest. So therefore, this is indicative of technically an immoral act, like it or not. And I know there are a lot of people out there that are grateful to have been pushed into existence and appreciate it deeply. But just ask yourself, for what? Pleasure-seeking activities? Is that what it is? Just raw hedonism? Backdropped against a life of mundane routine and pointless empty lives of quiet desperation and frustrating futility? To endure large amounts of suffering, boredom, and tedious undertakings, just to have one small sip of ecstasy. It seems we have forgotten about the training ground and has become instead a lounge for fat cats and lazy lizards. But I won't go too far into depth about the positive aspects of choosing not to procreate, perhaps reserving these thoughts for a future video. For the main idea of this exposition is to show how antinatalism is nihilistic philosophy. As if antinatalism was somehow something else other than nihilism. Yeah, right. If you think so, then you must somehow have your narrative about the logic twisted up. I know. You have certain subjective feelings about certain facts, and since the fact is a fact, how you feel about those facts must also be facts. I know. Anything less would be a case of mental illness. But one should always try to understand who one's friends are, and one should also try real hard to stop maligning and demonizing an adjacent ally in exactly the same way everyone else is trying to malign and demonize you. Atheism, antinatalism, nihilism, postmodernism, deconstructionism, futurism, transhumanism, are all relative philosophies existing within the same ideological cluster, despite having some minor differences. Maybe what they all share in common, in a broad sense, is a rejection of an old world and an old way of doing things. Because you do know that, in theism's mind, atheism, and thereby also antinatalism by default, are considered nihilist philosophies simply because they both reject theism. And you know this is where nihilism primarily got its bad name from. It was a label frequently used to malign those that rejected theism. And I say antinatalism by default because I think it's safe to assume that if you are an antinatalist, you certainly can't be any kind of theist worth his salt. What kind of a theist would think that being fruitful isn't in accord with a sky daddy's wishes? Unless there are theists out there that I don't know about who believe in an incompetent, fucked up God who can't be trusted. But if that's the case, why bother remaining a theist? Overthrow that motherfucker. If believing in a loving, all-powerful God while having an attitude that the world is too fucked up a place to bring children into isn't cognitive dissonance, then what is? And I wonder, just as a side note, who was worse for the theists? The atheists, the heretics, or the nihilists? I guess we'll never know. But anyway, yeah. Antinatalism is a form of nihilism. So it's truly quite very bizarre that antinatalism tries to take the high road, goes holier than thou, and plays a role of a moral warden against another philosophy that, in fact, represents some of the same concepts and positions. Nihilists advocate victimization and or ignoring victimization. Bullshit. That isn't even the case, so it isn't even true in the first place. It isn't nihilists who are the ones responsible for the horrors of the world, nor the ones ignoring the horrors. So, maybe instead of trying to straw man a scapegoat, antinatalism should either redirect this false characterization right back from whence it came, or try focusing their vitriol upon that which is more befitting of these tragic poetic condemnations. It would seem to me that theists and statists are the violators of innate human morals. And don't let the religious aspect of theism create some false sense of a dichotomy existing between theism and its slave atheism. They are both materialists. Only one is justified by a belief in God, and the other is justified by a lack of belief in God. The materials are on a pedestal in both of these so-called diametrically opposed polar opposite positions. And post-hence, they are both full of shit. Neither one of them are automatically morally upright. Religion. Do we even need to go there? If Jesus came back, he'd kick the shit out of the Christians. Once he matrixed around the gunfire. And atheism, well, where does one exactly derive morality when there isn't some scary supernatural force threatening you? Or offering obedience rewards, in a world where cash is king. and only the collection and hoarding of objects and resources are the measure of one's well-being. From whenceforth and unto what? Oh, I know, from empathy, from compassion, from a sense of charity, from a sense of duty, integrity, justice, service, and honor. Only this sense of duty is easily derelict when it comes to the raw material reality. In a game of heavy investments and gambling with the margins of profit and loss, wherein the consequence of ignoring dysfunction and not running the risk to do what's called right is rewarded by sustaining a retainer of wealth and resources, the objectively moral thing to do is to do what most benefits yourself and your immediate group. And that's what I mean when I say objectively moral. I mean so in the sense that there will be groups of individuals who feel they have a special status to make decisions on behalf of everyone else, because this self-elected special status also affords one superior perspective to decide and execute what's best for everyone. Sound familiar? And it isn't nihilism that is doing this. It's hard materialism. 'Cause, hey, it's logical. It's objectively moral. It's very utilitarian. All of which the nihilist knows doesn't really exist. And therefore doesn't invest into the motivated fervor of this material passion play. And yet the criminal troublemaking shit-stir-uppers have the audacity to point out at the audience and blame them for the stage theatrics. And antinatalism, who sits over in Section B, points over to Section A, where nihilism sits, and passes the blame on to them. And that's a joke. But I can see why everyone's so upset with nihilism. True nihilism upsets the whole apple cart. The passion whores don't want people to resign and give up on the game of the lemmings. 'Cause, geez, what would happen if everyone became nihilists? It would be unprofitable. We'd have a bunch of peaceful, generous, self-sufficient people who had relaxed, forgiving, caregiving dispositions, who mind their own business but share and help others, and who don't want to victimize their fellow humans. And we couldn't have that now, could we? Pointing the finger at you and saying how it's all your fault is so much more convenient and fun. Yeah, Charlie.